Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Welcome to St. Louis on the Air. I'm Don Marsh. When we think of famous female aviators, undoubtedly the first name that comes to mind is Amelia Earhart. But she was just one of many women who were famous in that era, the 20s and the 30s. They operated in a man's world, but held their own in air shows and air races, barnstorming all over the country, drawing huge crowds fascinated by the novel flying machines and the people who flew them. My guest this segment was equally fascinated and has written a book about the women who lived in that world. The book's titled Fly Girls, How 5 Daring Women Defied All Odds and Made Aviation History. The author, Keith O'Brien, joins me in studio. Keith, thanks for coming in.
Oh, thanks for having me.
This is a perfect subject for International Women's Day, isn't it?
It sure is. Well, and I personally think it's a perfect subject for any day.
It is. You know, you've picked 5 women, but there were certainly more than 5, which surprised me.
Yeah, I want to be very clear. I didn't set out to write a comprehensive history of women in aviation in the 1920s and 30s, the sort of textbook history where each woman would have her own chapter. If you wanted to do that kind of historical book, you'd need 25 chapters. Mine is really a story about a group of friends. Mm-hmm. These women were friends, and they were fighting for the right to fly and race airplanes, and they were doing it together.
And the world at that time was like what? I mean, in terms of this barnstorming, this whole brand new aviation thing. What was the world like then?
Well, so, you mentioned air shows in the intro there. I mean, that's something that people certainly recognize today. These were totally different than that. These were real races with winners and losers, jackpots of money for the victors, enormous crowds. I'm talking about 500,000 people paying customers during the Great Depression coming out to watch races over the course of a weekend. An additional 500,000 would watch for free from the hoods of their automobiles parked on nearby highways. It was an enormous sport. I mean, in this little window of time, air racing was one of the most popular sports of America.
What drew them? Was it the anticipation, like a hockey game? You wait for a fight to break out. Were they waiting for these things to crash?
That was certainly part of it. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, these races were unpredictable. Anything could happen, so the danger was certainly a draw. But we have to remember, at this time, most people in America had never flown in a plane. These machines truly were magical. There was a romance to aviation that just, for most people anyway, doesn't exist anymore today.
Well, the 5 women you've selected all came from different backgrounds. Can you give me a thumbnail of each one of them?
Sure.
What drew them together?
So Ruth Elder was from Anniston, Alabama, was very flashy, a housewife already on her second marriage in 1927. She will set out to try to become the first woman to fly across the ocean. Amelia Earhart will come next, 9 months after Ruth Elder. At that time, Amelia was not a famous pilot. She was a social worker in Boston. Ruth Nichols was from New York City, the daughter of Wall Street wealth, and more than any other woman during this time, Ruth Nichols, who has been almost completely forgotten, will really challenge Amelia for the title of most accomplished female aviator. Florence Klingensmith from rural Minnesota was by far the most accomplished female air racer of the era, a better air racer than most men. And then finally, Louise Thaden, who's from Bentonville, Arkansas. And Louise was really the scarcest kind of aviator in these days. She was not just a woman who flew and raced planes. Louise was a mother.
What was it about them? I mean, they did come from different backgrounds, obviously. How do you connect the dots between these? What was alike about them?
That's a great question, Don, and I did spend a lot of time thinking about that when I was researching the book because, on the face of it, they were very different. But there were a few commonalities, and one really important one, and that is, even when these women were just young girls, still just girls, they knew they were different. They knew they weren't like the other girls they went to school with. Amelia liked to wear her hair short. Louise Thaden did too. Louise didn't like to wear the frilly white dresses that her good Southern mother would dress her up in Arkansas. Louise wanted to wear overalls and get dirty with the boys. They were different, and they knew it. And one of the things that I think is really important here, and a lesson that I as a parent have taken to heart today, is that, at a time when parents, and in particular fathers, could tell a young girl, a teenage girl, who she will or will not marry, where she will or will not work. These parents let these young girls, find their own path, choose their own destiny, and they did that.
Right. How did men accept the women coming into this field, which was male-dominated, obviously?
It was a struggle for these women. Many men in aviation, many pilots, many reporters in the press mocked these women, and would take every chance they had to take shots at them. Just to give you an idea, at these air races, planes crashed all the time, and pilots would often die right in front of the grandstands over the course of the weekend. It's something we can hardly imagine today, and still the race would go on. When a man died in these races, they would often be hailed as a hero. There were actually times when they would hold the funerals that very weekend on the airfield floor with moments of silence and flybys and ashes scattered from the sky from a plane. Literally, when a woman died in the air races, there were the critics, the male pilots to blame them, the male reporters to blame them. They not only faced criticism when they crashed and died, they would often be blamed for the crash when indeed it was just the fault of a mechanical failure or the plane itself.
And one of your 5 did, in fact, die under these kinds of circumstances.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
What happened there with Florence?
In 1933, Florence Klingensmith is invited to race against the men in Chicago. It's a seminal moment, truly in aviation history. And the reason why Florence is invited to race against the men is because she has proven herself to be worthy of that challenge. And in that race that day, she's flying what is known as a GB, a very, very fast plane of its day. And the GBs had killed many men before. And on this day, the GB, very fast, Florence was doing great, challenging for the lead. And as she made the lap at the home pylon, the tower in front of the grandstand, at the end of lap 8, the right wing of her plane began to disintegrate, tearing apart, buckling under the strain of the speed. Florence goes down. And, in the aftermath of that crash, Florence is blamed for it. And I guess most shocking to me, Don, not only is she blamed for it, but male aviation officials suggest that she has crashed this plane because she was on her period at that time. She was on her period, and that is a disgusting thing to say, and a horrible thing to do to a woman who gave everything to fly a plane. But the fact is, in the early 1930s. The U.S. Department of Commerce, which was the regulating agency at the time, that's the FAA of its era, had written into the rules of aviation that women were not to fly within 3 days of their period.
How did the other women react to Florence's death?
Well, they were, of course, devastated and saddened by her death, just as they were by the deaths of others. They were also infuriated, as a result of Florence's crash that day. The male aviation officials will ban the women from air racing. They'll kick them out, and it will be 2 years before the women, my other characters, Amelia Earhart, Louise Thaden, Ruth Nichols, knocked down the door, fighting their way back in. It was really, truly a turning point for the women.
One of the saddest elements of the Florence story was apparently she was trying to bail out of the plane at the time she knew she was going down.
She was.
Yeah.
She was trying to bail out. She knew she had a problem. She did exactly as she was supposed to do. What I described is something most people today would find to be shocking. Mm-hmm. But planes at that time were built out of spruce and linen, very lightweight materials. It wasn't uncommon for a wing to fail like it did for Florence, especially a very speedy plane like the GB. And so when she saw it happening, she peeled off course. She tried to get away from the crowd. She knew that crashing there at the airfield could kill thousands. There were 40,000 people there that day. She was trying to get away, trying to gain altitude to save herself.
The women were very, very competitive against the men. From the way that I understand your book, they were a real threat to the dominance by the men.
They certainly were, and the men perceived them to be as such too. And this was all unfolding during the Great Depression. And as it did, of course, the race purses, the prize money, shrunk at the air races.
What would typical prize money be?
Well, for the most celebrated air races of the day, you could win up to $10,000 to $15,000. Now, in today's money, that's a lot. We're talking about almost $150,000, right, over the course of a weekend. That's a ton of money in the Great Depression. And so, one key reason why the men, would use that crash in Chicago to banish the women is they wanted that prize money for themselves. It was not only a sexist choice they were making, it was an economic one. If the women weren't racing, if it was just men racing, well, there's more prize money to go around. And so, the men wanted that prize money, and so did the women.
What did these women do, and their colleagues, their peers at this time? What did they do to advance the cause of women at that time? And the women had just gotten the right to vote relative to 1920, I guess it was. And here they were competing against the men. Did they advance the cause of women at the time?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, you're right. 1920 was the year the women win the vote, and they win it in August of that year. And we, of course, now accept this to be fact. Of course, women should vote, and of course, they won that vote in 1920. But it was actually a long fight. And many states in the summer of 1920, many politicians voted against women having the right to vote. So even in 1920, it was a hot debate. They win it. But, when my story